People remember war by the sound of gunfire, the sharp cracking echo of rifles bouncing between stone walls, the shriek of artillery before impact. But for me, war is a scent, the bitter tang of burnt bread, not the kind that reminds you of home. Number this was bread made from sawdust and starch, cooked over scrap coal and fought over by grown men with hollow eyes. The smell clung to you, in your coat, your hair, your thoughts. That was Warsaw in 1944, not a city anymore, a shell, a theater of waiting. I was born in that city in 1919, when Poland had just risen from the grave after more than a century in pieces. My father, Stanisław, worked at the main post office, the one on Plaque Napoleona. He believed in uniforms and schedules and the dignity of service. My mother, Iwa, taught piano in the front room of our flat. She kept the metronome ticking even after the Germans came. She said time must continue even when the world does not. The occupation didn't come like thunder. It came like mold, slow, quiet, and suffocating. Street names changed, rations were cut, Jewish neighbors disappeared, public beatings became routine. A man once hung for stealing bread just down the road from our building. They left his body there for 2 days. I stopped looking at faces after that. By 1941 I had joined the Armia Krajowa, the Home Army. At first I carried notes, weapons, once even a pigeon with microfilm tied to its leg. They gave me the code name Lis, the fox, not because I was clever, but because I was fast and quiet. Fear made me that way. By 1943, after the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, something in all of us had hardened. We had seen what the Germans were capable of, block by block, life erased. We couldn't go back to surviving. We needed to fight. That's when I joined Company Zośka, named for a boy named Tadeusz Zawadzki, a scout who died planting explosives under a German truck. He was 22. We were all that age, or close enough. We met in empty basements and abandoned cafes, learned to build bombs from fertilizer, to fight with rifles that had been buried in fields since 1920. Our motto? Do what you can with what you have, and don't wait for perfect. And then there was Kasia. She wasn't technically part of our company. She moved between units as a courier, sometimes a medic. She wore a red scarf in her hair, said it helped her friends find her. I told her it would help snipers, too. She just laughed. We kissed once. It wasn't romantic. It was after a botched arms drop in Mokotów, when we thought we were about to be surrounded. She kissed me hard and said, "Don't die being an idiot." I didn't plan to die at all, but then again, nobody did. In July 1944, everything started moving faster. The Soviets were pushing west, smashing through German lines in Belarus. Operation Bagration had destroyed Army Group Center. The Red Army was approaching the eastern bank of the Vistula, and we all began to believe, maybe just maybe, we could free Warsaw ourselves before they arrived. Our commanders thought the same. General Tadeusz Bur Komorowski gave the order. On August 1st at 1700 hours we would rise. The time was known simply as W hour. It felt like an answer to a prayer we'd long forgotten how to say. That morning the city felt heavy, not in a sad way, in a ready way. People were quieter than usual, but they held their heads high. Children played in doorways. Old men polished shoes that had nowhere to go. I stood outside the church on Ulica Długa, watching my own hands tremble. My pistol was old. The safety stuck. My boots were too big. I didn't care. At 16:57 we crouched behind market stalls, tramcars, doorways, 30 of us. We had a few rifles, pistols, Molotovs, and one submachine gun that jammed more than it fired. Still, we were ready. I looked up and saw Kasia in a third-floor window, her red scarf unmistakable. She raised 2 fingers in a salute. I nodded, too afraid to smile. At 1700 hours exactly, I threw the first Molotov. It smashed against a German truck. Flames burst outward like a scream. Then came gunfire. Wild, chaotic, glorious. We rushed the Poczta Główna, the post office where my father used to work. Smoke filled the lobby. I stepped over a body and recognized the wallpaper from my childhood. The irony made me want to laugh. We thought, in those first 20 minutes, that we could take the city in a day. We didn't yet know that the Soviets would stop at the river, that the Germans would return with tanks and flamethrowers, that Wola would become a slaughterhouse, that Stare Miasto, Cherniakov, and Muranov would all be crushed to ash, that Kasia would vanish in a blast of brick and silence. But for a moment, the city was ours. We weren't ready, but we were finished waiting. And when the fire broke, we ran toward it. The first thing I remember after throwing the Molotov wasn't the fire. It was the sound. Warsaw had been a city of silence for 5 long years. The boots of occupiers echoed off cobblestone like law. You whispered in stairwells. You knocked twice before entering. We had grown used to quiet oppression, the kind that sat on your chest and taught you to breathe shallow. At 1700, that quiet ended. Gunfire cracked in every direction. Pistols popped like fireworks. German shouting mixed with Polish orders. The first screams came fast, real ones, and the city exhaled at last. We rushed the Poczta Główna, crouched low, firing blind. The front steps were slick with shattered glass. Someone beside me, I think it was Wacek, took a bullet to the thigh and collapsed, cursing God and Goethe in the same breath. We dragged him behind a bench and kept moving. Inside, the post office lobby was already half in ruins. A German officer, young, barely older than me, rose from behind a counter and raised his hands. Michał, always too quick with the trigger, shot him anyway. I stared at the body and realized I recognized the linoleum under him. My father used to bring me here to buy stamps. I kept moving. Our mission was to secure the building and the intersection just west of it. That was our zone. That's how the uprising was planned, street by street, building by building. Secure, fortify, expand, like ants under a boot. By 1715, we had the structure. A boy named Oleg, no older than 16, hoisted a makeshift Polish flag from the rooftop and shouted, "It's ours!" He was answered by gunfire. The flag fluttered anyway. We cheered. We shouldn't have. The Germans responded quickly. Trucks rolled through Plak Bankowy, and within 30 minutes we were pinned down. Zoshka Company had spread out, but communication was already breaking down. Our couriers, many of them girls barely out of school, ran across courtyards and through sewer lines with messages written in pencil on torn books. One of them, Magda, slid next to me under a balcony around 1740. Her face was streaked with soot and sweat. She handed me a crumpled note from Kasia. Held in Świętojerska, lightly defended, no reinforcements yet, holding. I held the note a moment too long. Magda punched my shoulder. She said, "Don't do anything stupid." I didn't reply. I was already planning something. The hours blurred. We took a building, lost a building. Ammunition was already short. For every rifle we had 3 men. I saw boys with Molotov cocktails and broom handles charging German positions, only to retreat bleeding or not at all. And still it felt like winning. For the first time in years, We weren't obeying. We weren't hiding. We weren't waiting for someone else to save us. We were standing, firing, screaming, singing. Yes, even singing. Someone started Warsaw Uprising on a rooftop, the old revolutionary march, and soon voices joined from windows, from stairwells, from broken basements. I joined in without thinking. I felt like I was standing inside a song, a hymn of cracked voices and clutched fists. By sunset we had secured our block. Barely. We set up a barricade with overturned trams, bricks, and sandbags. I watched an old man in a threadbare suit help lift beams, whistling between breaths. He tipped his hat to me. "This is how Poland is rebuilt," he said. But as darkness fell, the mood shifted. We expected reinforcements from other Home Army units, maybe even Soviet shelling across the river. But they didn't come. What came instead was the whine of German artillery and the steady rumble of tanks. We retreated into the post office again, turned it into a fortress. Sandbags in windows, broken doors as barricades, glass jars of turpentine and fire prepared for Molotovs. At 2200 hours, I found a quiet room near the top floor. Just me, a small radio, and the weight of everything. I fiddled with the dial, hoping for BBC, for coded phrases. Instead, I caught a few words from the east, a Soviet broadcast saying the Red Army had reached the Praga district. I couldn't tell if it was truth or theater. Downstairs, someone was playing a violin, badly but with heart. The same tune my mother used to hum while peeling potatoes. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes for a second. Just a second. When I woke, it was morning. Smoke hung in the air like fog. The barricade was still holding. The flag still flew. I hadn't seen Kasia since yesterday. Her name itched behind my ribs like a wound. The uprising had begun. We had stood up. And though I didn't know it then, this was the last sunrise I'd see from that building. Warsaw's old town, Stare Miasto, was always a place of beauty. Cobblestone alleys, medieval towers, shopkeepers sweeping stoops at dawn. As a boy, I loved to wander those narrow lanes with a notebook, pretending I was a poet. Now I carried a pistol and a ragged uniform, and every alley felt like a trap. By August 2nd, Command had ordered our unit to reinforce resistance fighters in the old town. The fighting had flared hot in Wola, and the Germans had begun executing civilians, not soldiers, not partisans, but families, children. Entire tenement blocks burned. By some miracle or madness, they hadn't broken through Stare Miasto yet. It became a bastion, a spine of the uprising. If we lost it, we'd split in two, so we moved block by block through walls. Literally, we blew holes in basements to crawl through buildings instead of crossing open streets. We called it mouse-holing. I crawled behind Michał through cellars that stank of damp stone and old onions. In one kitchen, untouched by fire, we stopped long enough to eat jam from a broken jar. "Not how I imagined war," he said, licking his fingers. "Better than boiled shoes." He laughed, then sobered. "You think Kasia made it to Old Town?" "I don't know." That was the truth. Since the first day she'd vanished. No word, no message. I didn't say her name aloud, as if that might jinx her survival. By the time we reached Freda Street, the shelling was constant. You didn't flinch after the first 100 explosions. You learned to count seconds between the whistle and the hit. You learned that every lull meant a rush. The SS Derlewanger Brigade, monsters in black, were pushing from the west. Tanks moved slowly, but their infantry was methodical, burning everything behind them. We made our stand at St. Hyacinth's Church, defending the courtyard and rear exit. We had 3 rifles, 2 stolen grenades, and a man who used to be a butcher, now wielding a hammer. For 2 days we held. At night I stood watch under shattered stained glass windows, whispering old prayers I barely believed. Sometimes I imagined Kassia's voice in the distance. Other times I heard nothing but the crackle of fire and boots on cobblestone. In those hours I learned what real courage looked like. It was Oleg, 16, who ran messages between command posts with a broken foot. It was Helena, a widow, who turned her ruined shop into a field kitchen and fed everyone who passed through with soup made from God knows what. It was Father Joseph, the priest who carried ammunition in his cassock, blessing the dead with ash on his fingers. We weren't soldiers. We were Warsaw. On August 5th we heard what had happened in Wola, mass executions, thousands killed, entire buildings emptied and torched with civilians inside. I didn't believe it until I saw the photos smuggled in by a courier, a girl no older than 12. Her hands were red from blood, not her own. Michał said nothing for a full hour. Then he stood, walked outside and threw a grenade at a passing patrol. It didn't explode. We dragged him back before they saw. He didn't speak again for 2 days. We fought on. At Krasinski Square we ambushed a German armored column with Molotovs and a single Piat launcher we barely knew how to use. One vehicle burned, the rest pulled back. For that, command gave us chocolate, British, dark, nearly bitter. I shared it with a boy named Wittek, who had never had chocolate in his life. He cried when he ate it. On August 8th, a woman in nurse's clothes arrived at our post. She limped slightly. Her red scarf was dirty but unmistakable. Kassia. She didn't smile, just looked me over and said, "Still alive, Fox?" Barely. She'd been tending wounded in Muranov, trapped until the lines shifted. Her hands were raw from carrying stretchers. Her voice trembled when she spoke of the wounded children. That night I sat beside her as the world rumbled. We didn't touch, just sat, like two pieces of something cracked, not yet broken. On August 10th, the Germans began pushing harder. Stare Miasto was crumbling. The Barbakan, our old gate, was half rubble. Artillery pounded day and night. The tunnels began to flood. Our positions weakened. Rumors came of orders to evacuate south through sewers. The thought made my stomach turn. I'd rather fight rats above ground than crawl blind into filth, but the orders were clear. We were leaving the heart of Warsaw, and some of us wouldn't return. When they told us we'd evacuate through the sewers, the room went silent. Even after all we'd seen, machine gun fire, tanks rolling over barricades, the smell of charred flesh from Wola, the thought of crawling through the filth beneath our feet left us pale, but Stare Miasto was collapsing. The Germans had breached Brzozova, the shelling never stopped, and our ammunition was down to single rounds per rifle. The wounded couldn't be moved, supplies were gone, and yet we still clung to the old town as if sheer will could hold the walls together. It couldn't. Orders came to evacuate, south, through the sewer tunnels to Śródmieście. There was no glory in it, no triumphant march, just a group of exhausted fighters and civilians limping down into darkness. The entrance near Plac Krasinskich was hidden under boards and rubble. When the hatch opened, a gust of hot, wet air hit me in the face like breath from the devil's throat. I gagged. So did most of us. The tunnel dropped nearly 2 meters, and the ladder was slick with slime. "After you, Fox," Michał said with a bitter smile. I went first. The sewers of Warsaw weren't just pipes. They were a city, beneath a city, built in the 19th century, winding, narrow, high enough in some places to crouch, in others to crawl. There were no lights, just ropes, guiding lines, and the person in front of you. I gripped Kasia's scarf so tight my knuckles cracked. The water, or whatever it was, reached our shins, then our knees. It was thick and warm. Every step was a guess. The walls wept. The air choked with rot. It was so dark that time itself seemed to vanish. I lost track of how long we were underground. Hours, maybe days. It felt like days. We whispered to each other to stay sane. Names, memories, dumb jokes. "Remember that cafe in Joliborz?" Kasia asked softly. "The one with the terrible tea." "You mean the only cafe in Warsaw with tea?" She laughed barely. Some behind us cried. A few went silent, too silent. One boy, a courier no older than 13, began to scream. He'd lost his footing and fallen in head first. It took 2 men to pull him out, sobbing, covered in things none of us named. We passed others down there, units moving opposite directions, lost or misdirected. One group had turned back. Another said the exit in Nowy Świat was under machine gun fire. We pressed on. At one fork, our rope split. The leader hesitated. I remember Michał saying, "Left is death, right is worse." We went right. Somewhere along the way, I hit my head on a pipe and nearly blacked out. Kasia shook me hard. I saw her face, her eyes glowing faintly from the light of a single match someone had struck. A fleeting moment of humanity. Hours later, dawn, I think, we emerged, one by one, gasping for air, soaked in sewage, into a broken basement in Śródmieście. I collapsed on a stairwell and retched until there was nothing left in me. We had made it, most of us anyway. We'd lost 5 people in the dark. One slipped into a side pipe. One shot himself rather than continue. One was too old. His heart gave out. We didn't say their names. Not yet. Not above ground. In Śródmieście the war looked different. There were banners on balconies, more armbands, homemade uniforms, women distributing bread from carts. There was music, not live, but from a hidden gramophone. I heard Chopin rising through bombed-out windows. I thought I was hallucinating. A girl handed me a tin cup of soup, thin, mostly water, but warm. I thanked her and tried not to cry. Later that night we regrouped in a school building converted into a command post. Maps on the walls, radios chattering in code, officers with hollow eyes and stitched uniforms. The battle wasn't over, not even close. We had traded one ruin for another, but for the moment we could stand, we could breathe, and above all, we had survived the depths. In Śródmieście, people still dared to believe. It wasn't hope exactly, not the kind that swelled in your chest. No, this was a thinner, more practical thing, the kind of hope that got you through another day, another shift on the barricade, another night huddled in a stairwell listening to the Luftwaffe overhead. But compared to the smoking husk of Stare Miasto, Śródmieście felt alive, not untouched. No part of Warsaw was but breathing, holding on. Here the resistance had managed to form something resembling a zone. A loose, shifting perimeter of barricades, sniper nests, aid stations and radio outposts. Civilians walked freely as one could in a city under siege. Couriers darted across intersections like swallows. There was even a newspaper, Bulletin Informacyjny, mimeographed daily. We bunked in a former grammar school near Marszałkowska Street, 30 or so fighters, some old friends from Zośka, some new faces from battalions Parasol, Krobry II and Kiliński. The walls still had children's drawings on them, red suns and yellow birds. Michał taped one to the butt of his rifle and called it his lucky charm. We had no illusions. The Soviets were still parked across the Vistula in Praga, doing nothing. The British dropped weapons now and then, brave pilots flying low over hell, but half the crates fell into German hands. Still, we fought. I took part in a failed push to retake Aleje Jerozolimsky. We lost 4 men trying to cross the street. The Germans had machine guns zeroed in on every open space. The pavement was blackened with soot and blood. One fighter, a girl named Anya, dragged herself back across with 2 bullet wounds and a grin. "Got further than last time," she wheezed. In the evenings we listened to radio broadcasts from London. The BBC mentioned us once. "Heroic Polish resistance," they said. We clapped like idiots. Later that night someone was shot through a window while washing their face. No one clapped after that. Kasia returned to our unit on August 16th. She'd been helping organize triage in Novogrodska, patching up what few wounded we could treat with gauze and vodka. When I saw her, her hair was shorter. Someone had hacked it with scissors. "I needed less to worry about," she said. We lay side by side on a classroom floor that night, backs against the wall. We didn't talk about love. We didn't dare, but her fingers found mine, and I didn't let go. By August 20th, Shrodmishti was holding, barely. The Germans had begun using Goliaths, small remote-controlled tracked bombs loaded with explosives. We watched one roll silently down a side street, hit a barricade, and explode with enough force to knock bricks loose from 4 floors up. We never got used to that sound. There were moments of levity, even in that madness. Someone built a makeshift movie screen from a bedsheet and ran a copy of Znakor, the pre-war drama, using a salvaged projector. I sat with my head against Kasia's shoulder, watching actors from another world say lines no one remembered. We all laughed at the wrong parts. Some cried when it ended. We still took communion, still read poetry, still lit candles on broken altars. And every time we heard the faint whine of German bombers, we scattered like ants. But we came back, again and again. On August 22nd, news came. The Germans had begun systematically destroying the city block by block. Not shelling, demolitions, dynamite, fire. They weren't just trying to win. They wanted to erase us. Command sent out a desperate plea for help to the British, to the Americans, to the Soviets. No reply came. I looked out over the rooftops of Shrodmishti that night, rooftops I'd walked as a boy, now blackened and broken, and I felt the fear turn to something else, not rage, not despair, resolve. We knew we wouldn't win, but we would make them bleed for every stone. There was a morning, I think it was the 26th, when I stood in the ruins of a burned-out tenement and realized I couldn't remember the color of the sky, not the real one, only the shades of ash and flame that had hovered over Warsaw for weeks. By the end of August, the uprising had become something else, not a battle, not even a siege, a kind of living death. A war of inches, of courtyards, of stairwells and doorways. Every window could be a rifle barrel, every silence a trap. We still held most of Shrodmishti, a pocket of organized chaos. Barricades made of furniture and tram parts, field hospitals in school basements, street kitchens pouring soup into chipped mugs. The resistance still operated barely. Companies Oshka, Parasol, and a dozen others, names that now felt like fragments of forgotten schools, scout troops, neighborhoods. We were too few, too scattered, but we were still there. Our command moved underground into cellars and sewers, issuing orders through couriers like Helena, a girl who could outrun mortars and climb like a cat. I watched her deliver coded messages between 4 battalions in one day, her boots covered in soot and her braids tied with red string. Above ground, the Germans turned fire into a weapon of despair, flamethrowers, incendiary shells, and block-by-block demolition. They weren't just killing the uprising, they were killing Warsaw itself. We fought street by street, sometimes room by room. On Wiltshire Street I cleared an attic with Michał and 2 boys from Crowbury too. One had a bayonet tied to a broom handle. The other carried a German pistol that misfired every 3rd shot. When we took the attic, we found a German sniper dead beside a bottle of brandy and a photograph of his family. I stared at it longer than I should have. Michał said, "You want to feel sorry for him?" I didn't answer. I didn't know. We pulled back that afternoon to a defensive line near Janek Zieliński, where the shelling was constant. I remember crouching behind a shattered car, watching flames eat through the windows of a once beautiful house. On the balcony, 2 chairs still faced one another, as if the owners had just stepped away for coffee and never returned. Kasia arrived with bandages and a new rifle. She didn't ask what I'd seen. She only handed me a crust of bread and said, "Eat." That night we held a position in the YMCA building, a strange place to make a stand. The gymnasium still smelled of chalk and sweat. We used medicine balls to block doors. Someone chalked a map of the city on the floor. We used it to plan our movements. Someone else played an accordion until a shell took out the roof above the changing rooms. Every fighter had a story like that. The absurdity of normal things in a city that no longer made sense. I carried with me a notebook, once full of poems, now used for maps and names of the dead. I wrote in it when I could, by candlelight or with the glow of fires outside. Sometimes I wrote lines I didn't understand. If the city burns, may its ash remember us. This is what a heart sounds like when it breaks with dignity. By the end of the month, the city had become unrecognizable, not just in form, in spirit. The crowds in Śródmieście had grown quieter. Civilians no longer asked about victory. They asked about bread, about water, about where to bury their dead when all the courtyards were full. A boy named Tomek, no older than 10, approached me near a ruined fountain. He asked if I'd seen his sister, described her as the one with the green ribbon. I hadn't, but I lied. I told him she was probably helping with the wounded. He nodded and walked away. I never saw him again. At night I lay beside Kasia and tried to remember the Warsaw before, the bookstores, the cafes, the smell of rain on Krakowskie Przedmieście. But it was gone. We were a city of smoke, and we were still burning. We began to speak in whispers again, not out of fear of the Germans. That fear had calcified into something colder, but because hope had returned, just a flicker, and we didn't want to frighten it away. The rumour came on September 3rd, passed from bunker to barricade. The Red Army was moving again. The Soviets had advanced into Praga, across the Vistula. Heavy shelling had resumed on the eastern bank. Some said they could see the flashes of artillery from rooftops. Others claimed to hear the thunder of tank engines. If they crossed the river, even just one bridge, it could change everything. By then the Germans had reduced Śródmieście to a stitched-together shell. We still held parts of Mokotów, Czerniaków and Żoliborz, but barely. Our defences were holes in walls, rifles that misfired, hands that shook from hunger. Still, when the news came that Soviet reconnaissance units had reached the right bank, we clung to it like driftwood. Our commander, Major Błyskawica, called a meeting in a collapsed library near Nowogrodzka Street. I remember standing beneath a blackened beam, listening to the plan. We were to send a detachment down to the Vistula riverbank through Czerniaków. There Soviet units might try to establish a bridgehead. If they did, we were to coordinate, hold the river line, defend it until reinforcements arrived. It felt like madness. It also felt like a chance. Kasia didn't want me to go. She said, They've left us alone for 5 weeks. What makes you think they'll cross now? I don't, but if they do, I want to be there." We embraced without words. Her breath smelled like mint and dust. She pressed something into my hand, a red string from her scarf. "Don't lose it this time." On September 6th, we moved through sewers and shattered courtyards to the Cherniakov front. The river loomed large and grey, veiled in smoke. The Germans had entrenched themselves on the embankments, using rooftops to pick off anything that moved below. We dug in near a warehouse with no roof and waited. The next morning it happened. Soviet artillery opened up across the river. A barrage of thunder, then boats, small ones, inflatable, dragging over sandbars and reeds. From them Red Army soldiers disembarked, 30, maybe 40 men. Latvians, someone said. They set up a makeshift perimeter, radioed coordinates, and then they waited, and we waited. No tanks followed, no flood of infantry, just a few more boats, a few more scattered soldiers. We fought together, awkwardly. The Soviets barked orders in Russian. We returned fire with German rifles and polite nods. At night we shared matches and stared across the river, hoping to see movement. But there was none. The bridge never came. On September 9th, the Germans counter-attacked with everything they had. Mortars, machine guns, flame. The river turned red and black, full of bodies and broken boats. We held the line for 2 days, then 1, then hours. I watched Jurek, a boy who once played violin at my school, drag a wounded Russian officer behind a pile of bricks and die beside him. I saw Sorin, our radio operator, take a shell fragment to the face while calling for air support that would never come. By September 12th, our unit was gone. I was one of the last to fall back, staggering into a cellar with blood in my ears, dragging my leg. I found a bandage. I found a bottle. I found silence. The Soviets withdrew from the West Bank. Quietly, efficiently, they had tested the crossing and left us. Again. When I finally made it back to Srodmisty on the 13th, I collapsed near the school where we'd once slept. Kasia found me the next morning. She knelt beside me, held my hand. "You still have it," she whispered. I looked down. The red string from her scarf, now stained and frayed, was still wrapped around my wrist. I nodded, unable to speak. There would be no more bridges, only us and the city. By mid-September, even the bravest among us had stopped talking about victory. We were still fighting, block by block, ruin by ruin, but the rhythm had changed. It wasn't resistance now. It was endurance, survival. Every gunshot, every shell, every scream echoed through fewer and fewer throats. The sword was broken. We were only holding the hilt. We still carried our weapons, of course. We still called out orders and patrolled the stairwells. But the ammunition was gone. Our medical supplies were down to scraps of cloth and whispers of morphine. Bread was a fantasy. Water came from radiators and bathtubs and rain gutters. And yet we remained. I watched Kasia disinfect wounds with vodka in a darkened hospital in Nowy Świat, tying makeshift tourniquets on children with hands too small to grip a rifle. She had a haunted look in her eyes that never left. She didn't speak unless spoken to. September 14th brought another rumor, this one louder, sharper. The Soviets had finally crossed the Vistula again. Troops from Berling's First Polish Army had landed in Poeschl, establishing a weak, flickering foothold. They fought for a day. Some units reached Solek Street. Then they were driven back. More than 1,000 men had crossed. Most would never return. The broken sword slipped deeper into the earth. Our command still sent out orders. We still received radio messages from London, still dropped leaflets, still drew chalk maps on school floors. But now every whisper of surrender felt louder than the rest. The Germans had begun using a new weapon, heavy rocket launchers called Nebelwerfers. The men nicknamed them screaming cows because of their wail. The first time one landed nearby, the earth convulsed. Half a building fell into itself. We dug out 3 people, found 6 more we couldn't identify. On September 17th, we tried to evacuate some of the wounded through the remaining sewer tunnels. Only 2 survived the journey. The rest suffocated, collapsed, drowned in the city's bowels, and yet we found ways to live. I remember a night when Victor, a theatre student turned saboteur, read poetry by candlelight in a bunker with half a ceiling. His voice was thin, reedy, but defiant. Someone clapped after a verse. Someone else cried. I held Kasia's hand and didn't let go until the flame sputtered out. The next day we lost our position on Złota Street. 2 grenades, 3 deaths, no progress. I buried Oleg, our youngest, under a stairwell and wrote his name in my notebook. It was the 39th I'd recorded since August began. By September 20th we knew, everyone knew. We were no longer holding the city. The city was holding us, a dying body refusing to let go of its own ghost. We had no more illusions of rescue. The Soviets wouldn't come. The Allies wouldn't land. The Germans wouldn't stop until the last window, the last bone, the last voice was shattered. In a rare meeting of company leaders, someone asked if we should dissolve and flee. No, Michał said. His voice didn't even shake. We're not ashes yet. Neither was Kasia. That night, as we sat behind a barricade of bookshelves and bricks, she pulled out a tin box and handed it to me. Inside were torn photos of us, of others, of the city. I looked at her. Someone has to remember what it looked like. I wanted to say something brave or poetic, but all I said was, I will. On September 24th, we got the official message. Command was considering surrender. Negotiations had begun. A silence deeper than any explosion followed. We sat together, not as soldiers, but as people, and waited for a decision that had already been made. The sword was broken, but we still held the memory of its edge. The surrender didn't come with a trumpet or a white flag. It came with nods, quiet ones. By September 25th, the last barricades in Śródmieście had been overrun. The Germans didn't need to shoot anymore. They stood at the edges and waited, knowing we would starve, break, or die without help. In Mokotów, the last resistance cells tried to hold sewers under fire. In Żoliborz, they held out 3 more days before the tanks rolled in. I still carried my pistol, still wore the red and white armband, now faded and torn, but I felt more like a ghost than a fighter. On the 26th, we received orders to prepare for formal capitulation. The resistance command, what was left of it, had entered talks with the Germans. The surrender would be military, not political. That was crucial. They wanted us recognized as soldiers, not partisans, not terrorists. If not for that distinction, the Germans might have massacred us all. Still, we didn't trust them. None of us forgot Wola. Kasia and I spent that night in a half-collapsed church. She stitched my jacket while I wrote names in my notebook, names of those we'd lost, names I was scared to forget. Oleg, Halina, Victor, Magda, Michał. I paused before hers. She wasn't lost yet, but I feared she would be. Do you think it meant anything? I asked. She didn't need to ask what. Maybe not now, she said, but one day, to someone. On September 27th, General Bor Komorowski signed the surrender order. By October 2nd, we would lay down our weapons. The uprising was officially over. 59 days. More than 15,000 resistance fighters dead. Over 200,000 civilians murdered. And a city turned to rubble. The next days passed in a fog. We were told we'd be allowed to march out of the city in formation. We would be sent to prisoner of war camps under the Geneva Convention. It sounded like a fairy tale, but on October 2nd we lined up near Aleje Jerozolimsky, broken but upright, and walked. We wore whatever pieces of uniform we had left, armbands, torn shirts, homemade insignia. Some of us held our heads high, some wept, some stared into nothing. The Germans lined the street, watching, silent. I saw one of them, a young soldier barely out of training, look at us and turn his face away. We passed ruins that used to be homes, churches with open wounds instead of steeples, craters where memories had once been, and beneath it all the bones of a city. As we marched, people emerged from basements, women, children, old men, survivors. They didn't cheer, but they watched us like we were more than just soldiers, like we were something they'd remember. Kasia walked beside me, her red scarf tucked into her coat. "I thought I'd never see this street again," she whispered. "You won't," I said, "not the way it was." At the edge of Ochota we passed a group of wounded partisans. They couldn't stand. The Germans let us stop. One by one we saluted them. One of the wounded raised a broken hand and gave a weak smile. "Warsaw walczyła," he said. "Warsaw fought." That night they separated us by rank and unit. Kasia and I were told we'd go to different camps. She kissed me once, not hard, not desperate, but soft, final. "I'll find you," she said. And then she was gone. I was taken to a camp in Germany, crammed into a train with others. The doors shut, the wheels turned. As the train pulled away, I looked back through a crack in the wood. The sky over Warsaw was black, but I swear I saw a single spark rise from the ruins, a flame that hadn't quite died. The city was gone, but the fight would echo, in memory, in silence. In every stone they failed to grind to dust. I returned to Warsaw in January 1945. Not as a soldier, not even as a man really, more like a shadow of one, thinner, quieter, worn through like an old coat. The Red Army had entered the city on the 17th, and the Germans, finally sensing the noose tightening, had fled what remained. I came on foot, wrapped in a stolen overcoat, boots full of holes, no papers. No one stopped me, no one needed to. There was nothing left to guard. When I crossed the Vistula, I expected to cry. I didn't. I just stood there for a long time, staring at the ruins like I was seeing the bones of someone I had once loved. The skyline was gone. No spires, no rooftops, no statues of saints or poets, just piles of brick and ash, broken glass and silence. Warsaw had been erased. I walked the streets alone, or what was left of them. Every corner had been something once. A cafe, a bookstore, a stairwell where I'd kissed Kasia. I tried to mark them in my mind, but they slipped away. Even memory felt fragile. At Plac Krasinskish, I found the spot where we'd entered the sewers. The hatch was gone, buried under rubble. I stood there a long while until my knees gave out. Later I met others, survivors, returnees, men and women in torn coats with hollow eyes who clung to names like talismans. Zoshka, Parasol, Kilinski. Sometimes we found each other, often we didn't. I learned that Kasia had survived. She'd escaped a transport, hidden in a village, and returned just weeks before me. She was working in a hospital, tending to typhus patients and orphaned children. I didn't run to her when I saw her. We just stood across from each other in a room of the living and not quite dead. Then she smiled. That was when I cried. We buried the past slowly, not because we wanted to forget, but because remembrance became its own kind of mourning. Every time I told someone about the uprising, I saw the disbelief in their eyes. 59 days, street fighting, children with pistols, girls with bombs in milk pails. Yes, all of it. We were not martyrs. We were not heroes. We were just people who stood up when we weren't supposed to. In 1946, I helped clear rubble from Nowogrodska Street. I found part of the YMCA building where we'd slept. The chalk map was still faintly visible on one wall. I traced it with my finger and smiled. "Still holding," I whispered. The new Poland was something else entirely. The Soviets came not as saviors, but as rulers. Our home army credentials meant little, sometimes less than nothing. I buried my armband in a tin box behind a wall. But memory doesn't bury so easily. Every year I light a candle on August 1st, 1700 hours. Wherever I am, whatever I'm doing, I stop, I remember, and I wait for the city to fall silent again. Warsaw stands now, bright, rebuilt, stubborn. You can buy coffee where once we fought Germans with broken bricks. You can walk through Stare Miasto, perfectly reconstructed. The royal castle stands tall again. It is beautiful. But beneath every stone there is another city, our city, scorched and broken and brave. Sometimes when I pass a certain street or hear a certain note on the radio, I see their faces again. Michał, with his smile that dared death. Halina, running faster than bullets. Victor, quoting poetry beneath falling ceilings. Kasia, with that red scarf, tighter than any promise. We were the sword they tried to break, but the echo of that sword still rings in the stone, still cuts, still remembers.